Welcome. My name is Kate Moorehead, and I'm the Dean of the Cathedral of St. John in Jacksonville, Florida. It's my pleasure to talk to you today about Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene is one of the central characters in the Christian story, and yet the reason why I want to spend some time with you talking about her is because she is so often misunderstood and often sidelined. Alone of all the characters in the Gospels, Mary Magdalene never leaves Jesus' side. She's present at the cross, and she's present at the resurrection in all four of the Gospel accounts. Yet when we look at churches throughout the world, we often see St. Peter as being head of the church, and we always see Mary the Virgin, Jesus' mother, being revered and adored and sometimes even worshipped. But there's very few churches that are called the Church of Mary Magdalene, and very few places where we see her highlighted as the central disciple that she was. In fact, throughout Christian history, Mary Magdalene has often been seen as a prostitute and as a dark woman, a complex woman, someone who embarrasses us a little bit. We know that she followed Jesus, but we don't like to talk about her too much. So to unveil the true character of Mary Magdalene is to begin to understand a little bit more about women and women's relationship with Jesus, as well as the way that women have been understood throughout the centuries. Our church has often created a dichotomy between the two Marys, Mary the Virgin on the one hand, who's often vested in blue and seen as very pure and undefiled. And in the Roman Catholic tradition, Mary the Virgin is perpetually a virgin, although Scripture does tell us that she did have children because Jesus has brothers and sisters. But the Roman Catholics translate brother and sister with a secondary meaning, which is that of cousin. So perhaps Mary only had Jesus in their opinion. So on the one hand, we have a very pure Mary the Virgin who never has sex. And then on the other hand, we have this character of Mary Magdalene, who centuries of tradition have tended to paint her in the color red. And Mary Magdalene is often seen as a very sexual person, as a prostitute, as someone who may have tempted Jesus or tempted other people, as someone who was dirty. And so we are pulled into two extremes when we view the central characters, which were women in the gospel accounts. In order to fully understand why women are pulled into these two extremes of the virgin and the prostitute, I think it's important to go all the way back to the beginning of creation and the narratives that are found in the very beginning of the Bible in the book of Genesis. As many of you may know, there are two creation stories in the beginning of the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 1 tells us a story in which God creates the water and the sky and the stars, and then the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the animals, and finally, lastly, God creates human beings, both of them, male and female together. And whereas the rest of the creation is considered good, God says that male and female are made in God's image and that they are very good. And that's the entirety of that story, and God rests on the seventh day. The second creation story is very different. It looks to have been written earlier, whereas the first creation story uses the name Elohim for God. The older creation story uses the name Yahweh. And in Genesis chapter 2, that creation story begins with the Garden of Eden, and God creates this creature called Adam. Now, for many centuries, Christians have thought that Adam was a proper name of a man, but in the ancient Hebrew, Adam is made of Adamah. Adamah is earth, and Adam is earth creature. And this earth creature, although masculine in gender, is not male or female, but rather just made of the earth. And after all of the creatures are made and Adam names them, Adam is still lonely, so God causes Adam to sleep, and out of his side, the more accurate translation in the Hebrew is his side, God takes apart Adam, and one side is called Isha, which is woman, and what is left over is called Ish, which is man. So depending on how you view that second story, it could be that men were created first, but really it looks like in the Hebrew it was probably this earth creature, this neuter character that was first and then split into male and female. Further on in that second creation story, we see this woman, Eve, who leads Adam by eating the fruit first and then giving Adam some of that fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Therefore, women are typically blamed for the fall of humanity, because if Eve hadn't eaten the fruit, perhaps Adam wouldn't have been tempted by her to eat it. And in that temptation, we've often gotten confused with sex. Now, how that's come about, I'm not sure, because the act of the fall had to do with eating. It did not have to do with sex. It didn't have to do with murder or stealing or anything. It had to do with consuming something that God said not to consume, which is very interesting when you think that how we write our relationship with God as Christians, and particularly in the Episcopal Church, is also through eating in the act of the Eucharist. So on the one hand, we have Eve, who is seen as subservient to Adam, and then we have this woman in the first creation story in Genesis 1, who is created along with the man. And Jewish Midrash has come to call her Lilith. Now, she doesn't actually have a name in the Bible, but the rabbis gave her the name Lilith and imagined that maybe since Lilith was equal to Adam, she wasn't as popular with Adam and he had her banished. So again, we have these two extremes of women. We have Eve, the subservient, and we have Lilith, the powerful, the one that was kind of unacceptable. So how are women perceived in Scripture? It's an interesting question, and it helps us understand the role of Mary Magdalene. The word prostitute is never used in the Gospels, nor in the entire New Testament. So why was Mary Magdalene considered a prostitute? The answer to that question is complex, and it leads us to wonder why we have, through the centuries, been so fascinated with sex. Why do we consider Mary Magdalene to be a woman who made her living through sex when there's no indication of that at all in the Scriptures? Not only do we think of her as a prostitute, but there are many writers who've considered other sexual ways that Mary Magdalene could have been in relationship with Jesus. Take, for example, the Da Vinci Code, this fascinating novel and movie that was made recently in which Mary Magdalene has not only a relationship with Jesus, but ends up marrying him and they have kids. Or Kazantzakis, where Jesus has this fantasy of marrying Mary Magdalene. Why is it so hard for us to imagine that Mary Magdalene could have been a disciple like the other disciples who loved Jesus, but that doesn't necessarily mean that she had sex with Jesus? In fact, as you look across the recent history of the church, we seem to have a great fascination with sex that has not been doing us any good at all. In the Roman Catholic Church, there's been such awful misconduct cases of scandal with priests. And in the Episcopal Church, we've gotten completely derailed by talking about homosexuality and who's sleeping with who and whether they should be and all of this. The reality is that Jesus never talked about sex. He talked about money a great deal, but I think we don't really want to talk about money. We'd rather talk about who may be sleeping with who, because we find that fascinating as Americans. But to understand Mary Magdalene is to realize that there is no word for prostitute, but Mary Magdalene was a woman who was single and was probably left alone because she was possessed. And so in order to understand Mary Magdalene, we also need to look at what it means to be possessed by demons. But before we look at that, let's ponder for a minute why we jump to the conclusion that because Mary Magdalene did not have a husband, that she must have been in some kind of sexual relationship with Jesus. And is that realistic at all, given the fact that Jesus didn't seem concerned with sex at all, that he never talked about it? Is it possible for a woman to love Jesus without it being sexual? Was Mary Magdalene celibate? Was she married? The only thing that we know about her in Scripture is in the Gospel of Luke, it says that Mary Magdalene was possessed by 7 demons. Demon was a very broad concept in the biblical times. A demon was anything that would manifest in a person that they couldn't control, that could not be explained, and that was completely abnormal, something that you couldn't see. So a demon could range from what we would call today epilepsy, when someone just all of a sudden falls to the ground and has seizures, to people that bled uncontrollably, to people that shook or had twitches, to people that heard voices, to people that cut themselves, to people that just behaved irrationally for no particular reason. Back in biblical times, they didn't know how to understand these things, they didn't know how to explain them, and they were so much more spiritually based. I think today we have medicalized and sterilized these issues because we can affect them with drugs, but they still do have a great spiritual side to them that we sometimes ignore. So Mary had 7 different manifestations of something abnormal. 7 different things, which means she must have been an afflicted woman. And it also means that Mary most likely was cast out by her family. Back in Jesus' time, how would you deal with someone who was flailing around on the ground, or who was cutting themselves, or taking rocks and hitting themselves with it? People would be unable to cope, and they'd just put them out on the street. There were no hospitals, no institutions, and to a certain extent today we still find many mentally ill people on the street. So most likely Mary was a woman who was afflicted, was tormented, had no home, and was very alone. Would she have had sex? She may have been raped, but she would not have been any kind of good material to be a wife, that's for sure. And probably she was not raped, at least not very often, because demons were frightening to people. They did not want to be with someone who acted crazy. People didn't know if it was contagious. They didn't know if the demon would jump out of one person and jump into another, as we see those demons that jump into the swine when Jesus casts them out in the Gospels. So most likely Mary was quite alone, ostracized, had to beg for food, was dirty, would not have understood herself. Her life was spinning out of control when she finally met Jesus. And he healed her. And that healing began her new life, and she would not be separated from him from that moment onwards. And no wonder, because he made her well in a way that no one ever had been able to before.